How often can someone say that a musical movement changed rock? Many were successful, many lasted for years, and some still do. But very few managed to change the way an entire genre of music is played. And one of those was the new wave of British heavy metal. And to think that it wasn't even a clear musical style. Britain in 1976 wasn't exactly one of the best places to live. The euphoria of the late 60s had given way to a deep economic crisis that affected every aspect of the country's social fabric, but of course primarily the working class. Thousands of young people across the country saw that their only option for employment was the factory, and some of them decided to change the script, to try something different. They had no guarantee of achieving anything, quite the opposite in fact. But they tried anyway. They were all working-class kids. They never imagined that one day some of them would become incredibly wealthy through their involvement with a musical genre. Rock. In 1976, rock music on the island was going through a crisis similar to that of society. The legendary trio of Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, and Led Zeppelin weren't in their best shape. The first were going through an identity crisis, the second had disbanded, while the third were facing personal problems that were also evident in the level of the music they produced. The middle names weren't doing particularly well either. Within the year, Uriah Heep would fire their iconic singer David Byron, while Budgie and Hawkwind would release the first mediocre albums of their careers. Some new names had begun to tentatively appear: Queen, Bad Company, Rainbow, Status Quo, UFO, Thin Lizzy, Nazareth, but they had by no means reached the height and status of the big names who were struggling. That year, we will have a musical revolution that will take place in 2 parts and will bring, perhaps unexpectedly, inspiration and determination to dozens of young people who will understand that picking up a guitar and playing rock could actually take you somewhere. 1976, and especially 1977, were the years of punk in Great Britain. The genre originated from accumulated anger towards both the state of the country and the dinosaurs of rock. The origin wasn't so much from the working class, and there was also a centre for the whole scene, London. But the impact was enormous. Young rockers were watching these new bands on television or even at concerts and understood that their mere presence could change the game. They liked the raw energy they exuded. They liked the simplicity and directness. Here we had 2-minute anthems based on rock and roll, not a 45-minute solo. Punks wore jeans and leather, not kimonos and kaftans. Still, they didn't like everything. Political lyrics were never their cup of tea. The fashion with the safety pins and the spiky hair repelled them, and they knew they could play more technically than the punks. They also saw that there was a large critical mass of fans, mainly in smaller towns across the country, who didn't really like punk, who still wanted rock. And they decided to give it to them. The second part of the revolution was closer to what they knew. On March 26, 1976, Judas Priest, a still unknown band from the working-class depths of Birmingham, released Sad Wings of Destiny. In there they play a raw, angry, and modern heavy rock that makes a conscious effort to break away from the hard rock tradition of the recent past, which was based on blues and psychedelia. In the summer of 1977, Motorhead, a London band led by former Hawkwind bassist Lemmy Kilmister, released their debut album. Here, we had a rock band that combines the tradition of the distant past with the modern aesthetic of punk, in the way it is expressed on the album and especially on stage. Starting with these albums, the 2 bands will slowly start to rise and become known throughout the island. On the upcoming tours, they will be seen by many young and eager rock fans, and some of these fans, who had already formed bands, will even perform as support acts, showing that something could happen, something could change in their grim reality. Influenced by all these events, and almost as if they had agreed beforehand, dozens of British musicians will start forming bands between 1976 and 1978. Just read the list. All these artists had two common characteristics. They all played a form of heavy rock, and none of them knew about the existence of the others. You see, punk faded quickly, but it was replaced by something even worse for young rock enthusiasts: disco. Bands had a very hard time finding places to play. They performed in schools, gymnasiums, outdoors, or even in what were called working men's clubs. These private workers' clubs, where they and their families could go to enjoy themselves in various ways, with one of them being live music. All of these young musicians were more or less confined inside their city, or at most county of origin. For the time being, they couldn't know about what was happening elsewhere. They didn't really make any money, so many of them took odd jobs to make a living. At first, they played covers of popular hard rock bands of the time, but they soon started writing their own songs. In a short period of time, through their persistence and hard work, they gained dedicated cores of dozens or even hundreds of fans who followed them wherever they played. All this created a buzz, a feeling that something was happening, something was moving in the UK rock underground. However, all this was happening unbeknownst of the general public or even mainstream rock fans. This situation was about to change in 1979. Three things played a decisive role in the recognition and success of what was not yet named the new wave of British heavy metal: DJ Neil Kay and Sounds magazine, independent record labels, and radio producer Tommy Vance. From 1975, Neil Kay was a DJ at a disco club called the Bandwagon in Kingsbury, northwest London, which was located in the back room of the Prince of Wales pub and had a huge sound system. At some point, he decided to play exclusively hard rock and heavy metal music on the nights he was DJing, transforming the Bandwagon into the heavy metal soundhouse. These heavy metal nights became such a huge success that he started compiling a top 100 list of the most popular songs he played. Gradually, along with songs by established artists, tracks by still unknown local bands began to be played on his turntables, brought to him as demos by customers or even band members themselves. One of those demos was from an East London band called Iron Maiden, and the band's singer, Paul Di'Anno, personally gave it to him in 1979. Kay told him he probably wouldn't listen to it because he was receiving dozens of tapes every day at that time. But he eventually did, and immediately realized this band was going places. That's how he started playing their songs regularly. Very soon their song Prowler reached #1 on this top 100. Kay himself had been trying for a long time to get Sounds magazine journalist Jeff Barton to the Soundhouse to see firsthand the success of his heavy metal nights. Barton finally went and was so impressed that the magazine began consistently covering the scene, publishing interviews of these up-and-coming heavy metal bands and writing reviews of their concerts. In a review of one of these concerts, which took place on May 8, 1979, at the Music Machine Club in London and featured Angel Witch, Iron Maiden and Samson, he coined the term New Wave of British Heavy Metal, following a suggestion by his editor Alan Lewis. The term quickly caught on and began to be used more widely. The truth is, the bands that were placed under this moniker had very few stylistic common points. Some played hard rock with a blues bass, others hard rock with pop sensibilities, others heavy metal influenced by Judas Priest, others punk-like heavy rock inspired by Motorhead, and bands like Venom were something even more extreme that hadn't been categorized or labeled yet. However, the invention of the term had one good thing. It made bands realize how many others in the country were doing the same thing as them. That's how they started touring together, supporting each other, influencing each other musically, or simply watching what the other was doing. Let's move on to the companies now. It's amazing when you think about it, but by the end of 1978, only two bands that could be considered part of the movement had released albums: Quartz with their self-titled, and Marseille with Red, White and Slightly Blue. However, 1979 is the year that Motorhead had two very successful releases, and Judas Priest achieved global recognition with Unleashed in the East. This, combined with Neil Kay's charts, the continuous coverage of new bands by Sounds, and the plethora of demos being released, showed that there was a huge potential in this new scene. The first to move will be small independent companies like Neat Records, Heavy Metal Records, and Ebony Records. initially releasing single collections and then full albums. So during the year, the first albums by Saxon, Samson and Money from Birmingham were released, along with two very important EPs. The first, self-titled by Def Leppard, and the Soundhouse tapes by Iron Maiden, on which they had practically transferred the demo they gave to Neil Kay onto vinyl. Also, several of the future significant names had at least one single or EP to their name. Girl School, Praying Mantis, Gaskin, Witchfind, Savage. Many bands signed with these new independent companies, which, while they did release their first albums, had limited distribution capabilities outside the UK. Others, like Iron Maiden, Def Leppard and Diamond Head, decided to wait and produce their first releases themselves, selling them by mail or at concerts. They will eventually be vindicated, as they will be signed by major labels. The third piece of the puzzle fell into place when Tommy Vance, a BBC radio presenter, realized something was happening and started playing all these new bands on his show, The Rock Show, on BBC Radio 1, late every Friday nights. Along with John Peel's shows, Vance's show was the only nationally broadcast radio program that featured songs by underground metal bands, many of whom were invited to play live in the BBC studios under the supervision of Vance's longtime collaborator and producer, Tony Wilson. This helped these bands become even more well-known, as it was the first time their music was heard by an audience outside their city or county. 1980 is the year when the scene broke into the mainstream. That's when the first albums by Iron Maiden, Angel Witch, Diamond Head, Girl School, White Spirit, Tigers of Pantang, Witchfind, Def Leppard, Fist, Ethel the Frog, as well as two albums by Saxon, were released. Bands were now touring throughout the country, while some even crossed into mainland Europe. From a chart perspective, the biggest success in both albums and singles was achieved by Iron Maiden and Saxon. Both bands will make their first appearance on the most popular music television show in the UK, Top of the Pops, which Motorhead had already been on during the previous 2 years. The scene had now been fully recognized throughout the country. This popularity will bring a second wave of bands who will be inspired by this success and will be formed during the period we are examining. I mention by name
1,000 days in Sodom. The way to Enforcer. Don't you know it's the night of the demon?
Some of these bands took much less time to release their first album: Venom, Demon, Witchfinder General, Tank, Saracen, Legend, Shiva, etc., compared to their peers who had started the scene. In reality, companies that 2 or 3 years earlier weren't interested in rock at all now wanted at all costs to have a band of this new scene on their rosters. The movement had now fully established itself on the island, was known in Europe, and was beginning to cautiously look toward the other side of the Atlantic. As early as 1981, Iron Maiden and Def Leppard had completed their first American tours, while Saxon would debut there in 1982. This actually resulted in representatives and managers from American companies coming to England to sign on the spot the new big name that would emerge from the scene. Perhaps the peak moment of the entire movement came on August 16, 1980, when the first Monsters of Rock festival was organised at the area near Castle Donington in central England. Neil Kay was the DJ and MC, while Judas Priest and Saxon performed, playing in front of more than 35,000 fans for the first time, their largest audience up to that point. The following year, Tommy Vance will be the DJ, and more will be on the festival lineup. After the movement was recognized and gained prominence at a national level, Jeff Barton declared it finished in 1981, which was more of a symbolic move as new bands continued to form and albums to be released. By 1983, however, things really didn't seem to be going so well for the scene. The musicians involved have often stated that from that year onward, there was a feeling that things had deflated, and the scene was indeed finished. Many factors played a role in this, the first and most important being the heterogeneity between the bands. It wasn't just that they played different music, they also had different goals and visions. As early as their second album, High and Dry, 1981, Def Leppard began to shift their sound toward an American audience, causing the anger of their British fans. They didn't care at all as the new ultra-modern sound of their 1983 album, Pyromania, catapulted them to the top of the charts and made them global superstars. As for Iron Maiden, some said their relationship with the scene ended when they fired their singer Paul Di'Anno in 1981. It was as if the rope that connected them to the poor neighborhoods of East London had been cut. Their new singer, Bruce Dickinson, also coming from the scene, having been a member of Samson, allowed them to give their music a much broader profile and dynamic. Now they had opened their wings, and their target was the whole world. Among the others, Saxon had built a very strong reputation, which allowed them to continue their career at high levels, despite the rather mediocre quality of their releases in the mid-80s. Girl School remained relevant throughout the decade, overcoming some missteps, while Venom initially leveraged their connection to the thrash scene to stay on top, before seeing their career threatened by lineup changes and mediocre releases. As for all the others, they couldn't keep up with the changes in musical choices and preferences, and were forgotten or left behind. Some artists couldn't sell as much as the record labels they were signed to expected, so they lost their contracts and eventually disbanded. Others fell victim to their own choices. Diamond Head signed with MCA, and for some reason only they know, watered down the tight, dynamic heavy metal of their debut with a light, melodic, almost progressive sound that very few fans wanted to hear. Praying Mantis turned down an offer from American managers Peter Mensch and Cliff Burstein to sign them and take them to America because they asked them to change some things about their sound. The success they were expecting never came, and they disbanded in 1982. The truth is, musical trends were changing very quickly back then, and bands from the previous status quo had a very hard time adapting. When MTV arrived in 1981, most bands in the scene were completely unprepared for it. Def Leppard took full advantage of it, but most of the others fell behind. They didn't have the huge budgets to shoot impressive videos, nor were they visually very friendly to the new, teenage and predominantly female audience watching television. They only had their music, but that wasn't enough. The bands of the glam metal scene, on the other hand, seemed to have been made specifically for this new reality, and thus this scene quickly became huge, and all the attempts by the British to imitate them fell flat. As for the young teenage audience who preferred heavier music, wasn't impressed by MTV, and wasn't interested in music videos, it was almost completely absorbed by the new thrash metal scene, which was heavier, louder, wilder, and more modern than the new wave of British heavy metal, which of course had inspired it to a very large extent. So, as is often the case with musical styles, the decline was steep and abrupt, and by the mid-80s, the whole scene was simply a strange acronym that some people didn't even know what it meant. It may have been short-lived, it may have had a clear geographical origin, and it may never have sold millions, with a few exceptions, but the new wave of British heavy metal changed everything in the heavy rock scene in a way that influenced things for many years after its fall, which we just examined. It took a music genre that seemed stagnant and stuck, completely out of touch with reality and outdated by circumstances, and gave it life, a pulse, helping it transition into its new era. It took heavy metal from the hippie era, the huge shows and age of excess, and brought it to the 80s where everything was more immediate, direct, and simple. Without this movement, no one knows if the new heavy metal sound would have ever reached a wider audience or remained a peculiarity of Judas Priest, for example. It's important to consider that this new breath of life became clear as early as the movement's first year of success. In 1980, Black Sabbath gave their career a huge boost with Heaven and Hell, while their former singer Ozzy Osbourne saw his solo career get off to an excellent start with Blizzard of Oz. The bands of the former Deep Purple singers, Gillan and Whitesnake, found their way back to success, leaving behind experimentation and playing pure, unadulterated heavy rock. There is no doubt that all of them were inspired by what was happening, literally and figuratively, around them. Heavy metal re-entered the big leagues through the main entrance, and in a very short time became the biggest genre of rock music worldwide. Monsters of Rock, a festival started by the same people who helped launch the new wave of British heavy metal to give a home to the increasingly popular heavy metal scene, quickly became perhaps the premier outdoor music festival in the world. Jeff Barton founded a magazine dedicated exclusively to hard rock and heavy metal, called Kerrang!, which quickly gained a very large circulation. Millions of fans followed the genre, perhaps without even knowing how some kids from the UK had revitalized it a few years earlier. As for the musical side, the influence was quick to show. The US power metal scene, which began perhaps not coincidentally in 1983, was essentially a continuation of the new wave of British heavy metal on the other side of the Atlantic, as there were many common points between the two movements. Thrash metal and extreme metal in general were clearly influenced by the scene, both through Venom, obviously, and through the more extreme British bands like Diamond Head, Holocaust, or Angel Witch. Throughout the decade, Metallica, huge fans of the scene, kept covering tracks by new wave of British heavy metal artists, introducing many fans from all over the world to the bands that wrote them, Diamond Head, Holocaust, Blitzkrieg, and renewing their popularity. Let's say that according to one view, the new wave of British heavy metal scene didn't just continue in America, but all over the world. Throughout the 1980s, scenes emerged in many countries in Europe and Latin America, sharing many characteristics with the British. Just see for yourself. All in all, there were very few parts of the worldwide heavy metal scene that weren't touched by the new wave of British heavy metal. From the most popular, glam metal started with a band of the movement, Londoners Girl, and was hugely influenced by Def Leppard, to the most obscure, doom metal can trace its origin to new wave of British heavy metal bands, like Witchfinder General and Pagan Altar. There are no places of the hard rock or heavy metal edifices that we can't find traces of that scene. And that's why we will always be indebted to these musicians for changing rock history forever.